In May of 1947, on a Wednesday afternoon in the rolling, driftless country of Crawford County, Wisconsin, a 28-year-old farmer named Anton Mertes drove a brand-new green two-cylinder utility tractor home from the implement dealership in Prairie du Chien on a wagon hitch behind a borrowed pickup. He had paid $1,395 for it in cash, and the cash had come from a savings account he had built between February of 1946, when he came home from the European theater, and April of 1947, when he had taken over the home place from his father, who was 64, and going to live in the small house in the back orchard. Anton was a tall, lean man with brown hair and steady gray eyes, and a long, deep scar across the back of his left hand from a piece of shrapnel he had taken in Belgium in December of 1944. The new tractor had a green hood and yellow wheels and a serial number stamped on a brass plate riveted to the side of the dash. It had been sitting on the dealer's apron in Prairie du Chien for 9 days when Anton drove down to look at it on a Saturday morning in late April. He had stood in front of it for 20 minutes that morning. Then he had gone into the office and signed the papers. The dealer was a man named Floyd Hablett. Floyd had been selling tractors in Prairie du Chien since 1929, and he had sold Anton's father his first tractor in 1936. Floyd had said one thing to Anton that Saturday morning while Anton was signing the deal sheet. He had said, "Anton, you take care of this machine, and your son will run it after you." Floyd had not said it to be salesmanlike. He had said it because he believed it. The small two-cylinder utility tractor of that era was a machine designed to be repaired in a small shop with hand tools by a farmer who knew the engine as well as he knew his own hands. Floyd had grown up around them. He knew. Anton had nodded once and had finished signing. The new tractor was driven onto the home place on a Wednesday afternoon in May. Anton's father stood in the gravel of the yard and ran one hand along the side of the hood. He was 64. He had hand-cranked the family's previous tractor, a 1928 model that had been on its last legs since the autumn of 1946, for 15 seasons. He had said one thing to Anton when his hand came down off the hood. He had said, "This one will outlast both of us." Anton had not believed him at the time. He had believed it 20 years later when he finally understood what his father had meant. He had believed it 40 years later when he watched his own son take it over the way he had taken it over. Anton's son was born in May of 1942. They named him Roman after Anton's older brother who had died in the Pacific in late 1944. Roman grew up around the 1947 tractor the way other boys grew up around horses. He sat on his father's lap at the steering wheel from the time he was 5. He was running the tractor by himself on the hayfield by the time he was 14, in the summer of 1956, after his father had walked him through every gear and every grease point and every part of the magneto. He was 24 in May of 1966, when his father, now 47 and tired, in a way that men from that war eventually got tired, decided that the home place was Roman's to run. Anton handed Roman the small green tractor and the maintenance log and the leather satchel of wrenches that Floyd Hablett had thrown in with the original purchase in April of 1947. Anton said one thing to Roman that day in the doorway of the shed. He said, "This is a machine that gets handed across." Don't be the one who breaks the chain. Roman was 47 in 1989. The small green tractor had been running on the home place for 42 years. 2 miles east of the Mertes home place, on a county road that wound past a small Lutheran church and a creek bottom of birches, a man named Garth Helmer ran what had become, by 1989, a 320-acre dairy expansion with 140 milking head. Garth was 49 in 1989. His own father had been about Anton Mertes' age and had farmed similar ground a generation back, and the Helmer place had been about the same size as the Mertes place when both fathers were young men. The two operations had diverged starting in the late 1950s, when Garth's father had begun to expand and to mechanize, financing each step. Garth had taken over from his father in 1971 at 31 and had continued the same pattern. By 1989, Garth was running his 6th chore-grade utility tractor since 1957, each new one bought to replace the previous new one, each one financed at the rates of its era, each one traded in at a depreciated value when the next new one was bought. The arithmetic on Garth's 6 tractors, kept loosely in his head and in a stack of yearly receipts in a desk drawer, looked roughly like this. The 1957 model his father had bought new for about $3,400. The 1965 model bought for about $5,800. The 1972 model bought for about $10,000. The 1979 model bought for about $26,000. The 1985 model bought for about $38,000. And the 1989 model, the one he had taken delivery of that spring, at $52,000. 6 new tractors across 32 years, approximately $135,000 in sticker price, plus interest across the financed years, minus trade-in credits applied at each transaction, came out to a net out-of-pocket of approximately $110,000 across 32 years on chore tractors alone, about $3,400 a year, plus operating costs, fuel, and the dealership service work he had paid Lonnie Hablett to do, because Lonnie had a heated shop and a parts inventory, and Garth had a milking parlor he had to be in twice a day. Lonnie Hablett was Floyd Hablett's son, and he had taken over the dealership in Prairie du Chien from his father in 1973. Lonnie had been at the desk for Garth's 3rd trade in 1972, his 4th in 1979, his 5th in 1985, and his 6th in 1989. Lonnie had been at the same desk for Roman Mertes' only trade ever, a 1973 deal in which Roman had bought a slightly newer second tractor, a 1965 vintage row crop machine used for $2,400 to run alongside the 1947 for the bigger work. The 1965 model was now Roman's main tractor, 16 years old in 1989 and still running fine, and the 1947 small green tractor was the chore tractor, running the hay rake, a small mower for the orchard, a cattle feed cart twice a day, and the small disc on the vegetable patch behind the house. The 1947 was 42 years old in 1989. It had 3,940 hours on the original meter and probably another 1,500 hours of runtime before someone, probably Anton, in the late 1950s, had decided it was not worth maintaining the meter anymore. In late April of 1989, Garth came down the gravel road in the cab of his brand-new 6th tractor and turned into the Mertes drive. Roman was in the orchard, pulling a small mower behind the 1947, cutting the grass between the apple trees. The small green tractor was running quietly the way it had been running for 42 years. It made the unmistakable two-cylinder sound that men of Anton's generation had grown up with. That particular sound that gave the machines of that era their nickname for 50 years. A sound nobody under 60 really recognized anymore. Garth pulled the new tractor up to the orchard fence and idled it. He climbed down out of the cab. He stood at the fence with his hands on the top wire and waited for Roman to come over. Roman shut the small green tractor off and climbed down. The two-cylinder engine ticked quietly in the cooling air. Roman walked over to the fence, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Garth was heavy-set and broad-shouldered, with a wide-open face and a thick brown mustache, and the easy, ready laugh of a man who had bought a new tractor every 6 or 7 years for 32 years. He pointed at the new tractor with one thumb. He said, "Roman, the 6th one." He said, "I am on a 112-horse cab tractor, and you are still running a tractor your father bought before I was born." He said, "When are you going to come down to Lonnie and look at something newer?" He had said it not unkindly. Roman had nodded once. He had said, "That is a fine machine, Garth. I hope it does what Lonnie said it would." He had said, "The 1947 is fine." He had said, "I will be running it the year you trade for the 7th one." Garth had laughed. They had parted there at the fence. Garth had driven home down the gravel road in the cab of his new tractor, and Roman had climbed back up onto the small green tractor and had finished mowing the orchard. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments about a machine on your place that has been running since before you were born and is still running today. Those are the machines I want to hear about. The first time Roman had thought seriously about whether to keep the 1947 running had been in the spring of 1968, 2 years after his father had handed it to him. The chore tractor had needed a complete carburetor rebuild that spring. Roman was 26. He had not done a carburetor rebuild before. He had stood in the shop with the parts laid out on a clean white shop towel. The float, the needle, the jets, the gaskets, and had looked at them and had not known where to begin. He had thought that morning about driving down to Prairie du Chien and asking Lonnie Hablett what a new chore tractor would cost on a 5-year note. He had stood in the shop for 20 minutes thinking about it. Then he had gone back into the house and had taken down from a shelf above the kitchen wood stove the small black hardback ledger book his father had handed him in 1966, with the maintenance entries going back to May of 1947. He had opened it to the first page. The first entry, in his father's careful pencil hand, was dated May 14th, 1947, and read, "New tractor delivered. Original purchase $1,395 cash. Floyd Hablett, dealer." The next page showed the first oil change in October of 1947, and a small grease cycle in the spring of 1948, and on through the years. The carburetor on the chore tractor had been rebuilt 3 times, in 1953, in 1958, and in 1963, each time by Anton in the same shop, with the parts laid out on the same workbench. Each entry showed the parts list, the cost, the date, and a small note in the margin. The 1963 entry had a note that said, replace the float bowl gasket myself. That gasket was the only part I would not have known how to replace 10 years ago. Anton had kept teaching himself across all those years. The book was a record of one man teaching himself how to keep a machine alive across 2 decades. Roman had closed the book and had walked back out to the shop with it in his hand. He had set the book on the workbench beside the carburetor parts. He had read the 1953 entry and the 1958 entry and the 1963 entry one more time. Then he had picked up the float and had begun to work. The carburetor rebuild had taken him 6 hours that spring afternoon and into the early evening. His wife Esther had brought a sandwich and a cup of coffee out to the shop at dusk. Roman had thanked her without looking up. The chore tractor had started on the second crank that evening with the freshly rebuilt carburetor on it. Roman had written in the ledger book that night, April 21st, 1968. Carburetor rebuild, $22 in parts. First time I have done this myself. The tractor started on the second crank. He never seriously considered buying a new chore tractor again. For the next 21 years, he just kept rebuilding the carburetor when it needed it, and the magneto when it needed it, and the rings when they needed them, and the valves when they needed them. The 1973 purchase of the second tractor, the 1965 row crop, was for bigger work that the 1947 was never going to do, not as a replacement. The chore tractor continued. The ledger book continued. Each new entry in Roman's hand went in beneath his father's careful columns, on the same pages, in the same kind of pencil. The almost quit moment for Roman came at the kitchen table on a Sunday night in February of 1980. The corn price had collapsed the previous fall. The dairy operation was getting tighter. Esther had been quietly doing the math on the kitchen calculator for 2 months and had said the night before that maybe a more modern chore tractor would save Roman 2 hours of mechanical fussing a week, 2 hours that he could put toward the milking parlor or toward better fence work. She had said it in the way wives say things when they have been thinking about them for a long time and finally want to say them once and let the man think about it. Roman had nodded that night and had said he would think about it. He had sat at the kitchen table on the Sunday after with a cup of coffee in front of him and the radio off. He had thought about it for a long time. The 1947 was 33 years old that year. It was on its third magneto, its fourth full carburetor rebuild since the original purchase, and its second set of rings. The hour meter had stopped working at some point in the late 1950s. The yellow wheels had been repainted twice. The brass serial plate was a little worn at the edges from 40,000 grease-stained thumbprints across 33 years. He thought, that night, about driving down to Lonnie Hablett the next Saturday. He thought about it carefully. 45 minutes. Then he had walked out to the shop in the cold to feed the wood stove. On the way past, he had stopped at the inside of the shed door where his father had pinned in 1966, when the chore tractor had become Roman's, a strip of paper with one sentence on it in Anton's pencil hand. The strip was now 14 years old, yellowed, with the pencil starting to fade. The sentence read, "This is a machine that gets handed across. Don't be the one who breaks the chain." Roman had stood in front of it for a moment. He had not felt good about the sentence because he was tired and his back hurt and Esther was not wrong about the 2 hours a week. But he had felt right about it. Right and good are different things, and Roman Mertes had been taught the difference by a man who had come back from the European theater in 1946 with shrapnel in the back of his left hand and a quietness he had not had before the war. Roman had walked back into the house and had told Esther, before he went to bed, that the small green tractor was going to keep running. She had nodded and had not pressed him. She knew what it was. She had been around it as long as he had. The chore tractor ran the 1980 chore work and the 1981 chore work, and every year through the rest of the decade. The 1985 carburetor rebuild was the fifth one, $42 in parts. Roman did it on a Saturday afternoon in March, with his own son Mason standing beside him at the workbench. Mason was 12 that year. Roman was teaching him the carburetor the way Anton had taught him the magneto in 1956. He had said to Mason, when the float bowl gasket was being replaced, "This is the part I would not have known how to replace until I was 26. He had said, "You are learning it now." He had said, "The next rebuild is yours." Mason had nodded. In April of 1989, 3 weeks before Garth Helmer pulled into the orchard fence with his 6th new tractor, Roman and Mason had done the 6th carburetor rebuild together. Mason was 16 that year. The work had taken them 4 hours together on a Saturday morning. Mason had done most of it. Roman had stood beside him at the workbench and had watched. The float, the needle, the jets, the gaskets, Mason's lean teenaged hands moving through the same parts that Anton's hands had moved through in 1953, that Roman's hands had moved through in 1968. The 1989 rebuild had cost $48 in parts. Roman had written it in the ledger book that evening. He had handed Mason the pencil after his own entry and had said, "Write the date." Mason had written in his own neat young handwriting, April 1st, 1989. Mason's first rebuild. Father standing by. Roman had looked at the line for a long moment. Then he had closed the book and had put it back on the shelf above the kitchen wood stove. The cumulative parts cost on the chore tractor from May 14th, 1947 through April 1st, 1989, 42 years of running, was, by Roman's count carried forward in the ledger book, just over $1,900, about $45 a year on average. The fuel cost over those years had averaged about $300 a year, since the small 2-cylinder was a low-horsepower gas machine doing chore work and not field work. Total operating cost across 42 years, including the original 1947 purchase price of $1,395 and every part and every gallon of gas and every quart of oil, came to approximately $15,500 across 42 years, about $370 a year of running. Across the same 42 years, Garth Helmer's family had paid for 6 chore tractors, with cumulative principal and interest of approximately $147,000 net of trade-ins, plus operating costs, fuel, and dealership service, about 8 times what Roman had paid. For chore-grade work that the small green tractor had done equally well across the same period. Or to put it another way, the difference in money between the two operations across 42 years was about $130,000 in 1989 dollars. $130,000 is a lot of money in any era. It is the price of a 40-acre parcel of Crawford County dairy ground at 1989 prices. It is the cost of putting a son through the state university with money to spare. It is the difference between retiring at 65 and retiring at 73. Roman had not done the math in those terms in any of those 42 years, because the choice was never about the money. The choice was about the chain. The money was a consequence of the chain. In the spring of 1990, a year after the orchard fence conversation, Garth came down the gravel road again in his still new 1989 tractor and pulled into the Mertes drive. Roman was in the shop with the side door open, sharpening a sickle bar mower blade on the bench grinder. Garth came in and stood in the open doorway. He did not laugh this time. He stood and watched Roman finish the blade. Roman set the blade down and turned off the grinder. Garth said, "Roman, I want to tell you something." He said, "My father bought me a new chore tractor in 1957 because that is what we did. He said, I bought a new one in 1965 because that is what I had been taught to do. He said, I have bought 4 more since. He said, I have been thinking the last year about how my father never showed me what was in the maintenance log on his first tractor. I do not even know if there was a maintenance log. He said, my father took the tractors back to Prairie du Chien when they wore out and bought new ones. He said, I learned that from him. Roman did not say anything for a moment. He said, Garth, your father did what was being done. My father did the unusual thing in 1947 of writing down the carburetor rebuild dates and teaching me how to do them. That is the only difference between us. The bookkeeping, the teaching, the chain. Garth had nodded slowly. He had stood in the open doorway of the shop for a long moment, with one hand on the door frame. He had said, I am sorry I laughed at you in April last year. Roman had said, it is forgotten. Garth had stood there a moment longer. Then he had said one more thing. He had said, my son Wayne, he is 22. He is running my place with me now. I have not taught him to rebuild a carburetor. I would not know where to start. He said, do you think it is too late? Roman had thought about that for a moment. He had said, Garth, it is never too late as long as the machine is still on the place. He said, the machine teaches the man. The man does not teach the machine. Take Wayne down to Lonnie's parts counter on a Saturday morning. Buy a rebuild kit for whichever of those 6 tractors is sitting in your shop now. Bring it home. Spread the parts out on a clean towel on a workbench. Read the manual. Try. He said, that is how every man on this section who can rebuild a carburetor learned. They tried. The book is forgiving. The carburetor is forgiving. It will teach you. Garth had nodded. He had said, I will do that. Then he had turned and walked out of the shop. Roman had watched him drive home down the gravel road. Then Roman had picked up the sharpened sickle blade and had walked back out to the small mower hitched to the chore tractor and had finished mounting it. The 1947 had idled patiently on the gravel of the yard, in the way a 43-year-old machine idles when it has been kept correctly across all the years of its operation. Roman had finished the mounting. He had climbed up onto the seat. He had driven into the orchard to mow the grass between the apple trees, the way he had done every spring of his adult life. The 1947 small green utility tractor was still on the home place in 1996. Roman was 54. Mason was 23 and running the dairy alongside his father. Mason was the operator of the chore tractor now on chore days. The ledger book, going back to May of 1947, was on the same shelf above the kitchen wood stove where Anton had kept it. There were 3 generations of pencil entries in it, Anton's from 1947 through 1966, Roman's from 1966 through 1995, and Mason's beginning April 1st, 1989, the day of the 6th carburetor rebuild. The chain had not been broken. The 1947 is going to be running on the home place in 2010. If Mason keeps his hand on it, the way Roman kept his hand on it, and the way Anton kept his hand on it, it will be 63 years old then. The yellow wheels will have been repainted 4 times. The brass serial plate will still be riveted to the side of the dash. The pinned note on the inside of the shed door will be 44 years old, and the pencil will have faded almost to nothing, and the sentence will still be readable. This is a machine that gets handed across. Don't be the one who breaks the chain. Garth Helmer traded the 1989 tractor for a 7th new one in 1996, a 128-horse cab tractor at $68,000. Lonnie Hablett wrote up the deal. Lonnie was 61 then and was thinking about retirement himself. The conversation between Garth and Lonnie had been brief, the way it had become brief after 35 years of trade-in deals between the same 2 men. Garth had not stopped at the Mertes place that spring on the way home with the new tractor. He had driven straight home. He had thought about Roman a few times that year, but he had not driven down to talk to him about it. What he did do that summer was finally take Wayne down to Lonnie's parts counter on a Saturday morning and buy a rebuild kit for one of the older chore tractors he had kept around the place. Wayne and Garth had stood at a workbench together that afternoon and had spread the parts on a clean shop towel. They had not finished the rebuild that day. They had finished it the next Saturday. The carburetor had been on a 1979 model, not a 1947, but the principle was the same. The kit had cost $34. It was the first such kit Garth had ever bought. The salesman was pricing what the new tractor could do new every 6 or 7 years. Roman was pricing what a 1947 tractor could do across 42 years if a man kept his hand on it the way his father had kept his hand on it. Those are 2 different things. A machine that gets handed across is a machine that gets kept. A machine that gets traded in every 6 years is a machine that does not have anyone's hand on it for long enough to be kept. The 1947 stayed. The 6 did not. The chain held. Always put the money in the thing that stays. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. The next story is about a man in Iowa who built a grain bin in 1973 with $1,800 in sheet steel and bolts, and his neighbor who put up the same size bin in 1980 for $19,000 on a note, and what happened to both bins in the 1993 flood. It is the same story, told with different equipment. It is always the same story.